It begins with a silence that feels heavier than noise, an absence of confirmation, a delay in denial, and a vacuum where certainty is supposed to exist. For decades, the global military imagination has been anchored around a single assumption: that modern naval supremacy, especially in the form of U.S. supercarriers, represents not just power, but controlled invulnerability. The carrier is not merely a ship, it is a floating declaration of order, deterrence, and technological permanence. Yet in this reconstructed scenario, that belief is forced into confrontation with an unsettling question. What if the systems designed to protect that symbol were never built to withstand the scale of what now challenges them? The narrative does not begin with destruction, it begins with disbelief, the psychological fracture that occurs when a strategic myth encounters a possibility it was never designed to process. Radar operators see patterns that exceed expected thresholds. Command centers receive tracking data that multiplies faster than response protocols can adapt, and defensive systems, engineered for precision interception, begin to operate in a condition of mathematical overload rather than mechanical failure. Nothing stops functioning, yet everything stops being effective. The myth does not collapse in fire, it erodes under the weight of simultaneous uncertainty. And in that erosion lies the deeper shock. Not that a system could be overwhelmed, but that it could be overwhelmed within the boundaries of its own design assumptions. Military doctrine, long built on incremental threat evolution, suddenly faces the conceptual possibility of non-linear escalation, where scale, not sophistication, becomes the decisive variable. The emotional center of this moment is not the attack itself, but the realization that strategic confidence has always depended on unseen limits that were never fully tested. Intelligence reports, wargaming simulations, and defense briefings all contained assumptions about saturation thresholds. But those assumptions were abstract, never experienced under real temporal compression. Now, in this reconstructed frame, those abstractions become reality faster than decision cycles can complete themselves. The system does not fail because it is broken. It fails because it is asked to process more reality than it was ever trained to interpret at once. And beneath the technical breakdown lies a deeper psychological rupture, the sudden awareness that superiority is not a permanent condition, but a managed perception maintained only as long as scenarios remain within anticipated bounds. The moment those bounds are exceeded, even theoretically, the myth of invulnerability begins to dissolve, not through defeat, but through overload of expectation itself. The scenario unfolds not as a clean sequence of events, but as a breakdown in the very idea of a sequence itself. What should have been a structured defensive engagement instead becomes a layered collapse of timing, perception, and response. Early warnings appear fragmented, isolated blips on radar arrays that individually fit within normal variants, yet collectively begin to form an impossible density of inbound trajectories. Command systems attempt to classify, filter, and prioritize, but classification logic depends on assumptions of manageable volume, not exponential concurrency. Within moments, the system is no longer dealing with a threat. It is dealing with the interpretation of too many threats at once. This is where the strike ceases to be a traditional military event and becomes a systems-level stress test that was never explicitly designed into operational doctrine. Every defensive layer activates as intended: detection, tracking, fire control, interception sequencing, but each layer operates within its own constraint window, and those windows begin to overlap into contradiction. Engagement orders are generated faster than they can be resolved, and resolution depends on confirmation cycles that are already lagging behind incoming data streams. The result is not a single point of failure, but a cascading compression of decision time, where each successful function produces more input than the next function can absorb. In this environment, the concept of interception shifts from certainty to probability management under saturation pressure. What makes this strike structurally paradoxical is not its complexity, but its simplicity of principle. It does not require technological superiority in any single element, only synchronization at a scale that forces the defender to operate beyond designed cognitive and mechanical bandwidth. This is where conventional military expectation begins to break down, because most systems are optimized for performance against discrete, sequential threats, not simultaneous multi-vector saturation. The deeper implication is unsettling. The system is not being bypassed, jammed, or defeated in the traditional sense. It is being asked to solve too many correct problems at once, each arriving within a narrower temporal window than doctrine assumes possible. As engagement layers saturate, prioritization becomes the central battlefield function, yet prioritization itself requires time that no longer exists in usable form. And within that shrinking decision space, even successful interceptions no longer guarantee strategic containment, because the residual volume of unprocessed threats begins to define the outcome more than the intercepted portion. The strike, therefore, does not break through defenses in a dramatic moment. It accumulates beyond them in a statistical overflow that transforms probability into inevitability. What should not exist is not the weapons themselves, but the condition in which enough of them arrive at once to make every layer of protection simultaneously insufficient, not by failure, but by design limits being exceeded faster than adaptation can occur. At its core, saturation warfare is not about superiority of technology, but about imbalance in timing, volume, and processing capacity, a shift from qualitative advantage to quantitative overload. Every modern defense network is built on a hidden equation: detection speed multiplied by tracking accuracy multiplied by interception capacity must remain greater than incoming threat volume over time. As long as that inequality holds, the system survives. The moment it reverses, survival becomes statistically impossible regardless of individual weapon performance. This is where the illusion of invulnerability begins to fracture, because most public understanding of missile defense focuses on success rates, not concurrency limits. A system that can intercept 95% of threats still collapses if 5% of a very large number is enough to achieve mission failure. The critical variable is not interception efficiency, it is simultaneity density. In a saturation model, attackers do not need breakthrough technology. They need synchronized arrival patterns that compress defensive decision cycles beyond sustainable thresholds. Each interceptor launch is itself a resource consumption event. Radar lock, fire control allocation, missile flight time, and kill assessment all occupy sequential time segments. When incoming targets multiply beyond the system's ability to assign those segments uniquely, queue formation begins. And once queues form in real-time threat environments, delay is indistinguishable from failure. The mathematics become even more unforgiving when layered defenses are considered, because each layer, long-range, mid-range, point defense, depends on the success of the previous one to reduce load. Saturation disrupts this cascading logic by ensuring that no layer ever experiences a reduced load condition. Instead, every layer operates at maximum stress simultaneously. This creates a systemic bottleneck where effectiveness is no longer determined by firepower, but by throughput. How many decisions per second the system can meaningfully execute without degradation. Beyond a certain threshold, additional defensive assets do not restore balance. They merely redistribute failure points across multiple nodes. What makes this model strategically significant is that it reframes modern warfare away from precision dominance and toward temporal economics. Time becomes the limiting currency, not accuracy or range. The attacker's advantage emerges from forcing the defender into a condition where every correct action still produces incomplete coverage. In such an environment, even advanced systems behave like constrained queues rather than autonomous shields, constantly falling behind the incoming workload. And once the backlog exceeds the system's ability to resolve it within the engagement window, the outcome is no longer tactical. It becomes structural. Saturation warfare, therefore, is not a battle of better weapons. It is a contest over who controls the rhythm of decision-making itself, and who can force the other side to process reality faster than it can be understood. Modern defense systems rarely fail because they are blind. They fail because they are trained to see within boundaries that no longer match the evolving shape of reality. The core issue is not detection capability, but interpretive framing, how raw data is classified into expected and non-expected categories based on historical patterns. Military intelligence architectures are built on precedent, past conflicts, known adversary capabilities, and validated threat models that gradually become institutional assumptions. Over time, these assumptions harden into doctrine, and doctrine becomes the lens through which all anomalies are filtered. The result is a structural lag between real-world evolution and analytical recognition. When a threat evolves incrementally, each step appears insignificant in isolation, allowing it to remain below doctrinal sensitivity thresholds until it crosses them cumulatively and suddenly. This creates a cognitive blind spot where the system is not ignoring data, it is actively normalizing it until the moment normalization fails. Compounding this is the inherent bias toward symmetry in military planning. The expectation that adversaries will pursue parity in capability rather than asymmetry in method. Yet modern threat evolution often prioritizes imbalance exploitation over direct competition, targeting not stronger defenses, but their operational assumptions about scale, timing, and coordination. In such cases, misreading does not come from lack of intelligence, but from overconfidence in interpretive models that were never designed for non-linear escalation patterns. What appears on the surface as a static inventory of aging missile systems is, in reality, the outcome of decades of quiet, incremental transformation that rarely attracts attention until it is operationally demonstrated. Regional missile power does not evolve through sudden leaps alone, but through persistent refinement, guidance improvements, propulsion optimization, electronic resilience upgrades, and manufacturing scalability that collectively reshape the effectiveness of systems that outsiders often still categorize as legacy. The critical misunderstanding lies in equating visible design lineage with actual combat capability, when in practice the majority of performance gains occur beneath that visible layer. A missile system may retain an old designation while undergoing continuous internal modernization cycles that improve accuracy, reduce launch preparation time, and enhance survivability against interception attempts. Over time, these incremental adjustments accumulate into a qualitative shift that is not immediately recognized in external assessments, particularly when intelligence frameworks rely heavily on publicly acknowledged specifications rather than observed field performance. Meanwhile, domestic production capacity plays an equally important role, because scalability determines whether theoretical capability can translate into operational saturation. A system that is individually modest but mass-producible at scale becomes strategically significant not through its singular performance, but through its ability to be deployed in coordinated volumes that exceed defensive processing assumptions. This is where long-term industrial independence becomes a decisive factor. Once a production ecosystem is fully localized, it is no longer constrained by external supply disruption or technological denial regimes, allowing iterative improvement to continue uninterrupted over decades. The result is a layered evolution that is difficult to detect in real time because it does not announce itself through dramatic technological discontinuities, but through compounding refinements that only become visible when deployed collectively. In this sense, the true transformation of regional missile capability is not that new systems replace old ones, but that old systems are continuously upgraded until they no longer behave like the versions that external observers originally cataloged. By the time this divergence becomes apparent in operational scenarios, the gap between perception and reality has already closed in the most consequential way: on the battlefield, not in the briefing room. In the immediate aftermath of a high-impact strategic incident, the most telling signal is often not what is said, but what is withheld. Official channels enter a calibrated silence that is not absence of information, but management of information flow under uncertainty. This pause is where narratives are shaped before they are released, where fragmented sensor data, preliminary assessments, and command-level interpretations are filtered through layers of verification, political sensitivity, and escalation control. During this window, competing realities emerge. Operational teams work with incomplete but urgent data. Intelligence units attempt to reconcile conflicting inputs, and public-facing institutions delay confirmation until coherence can be established. What appears externally as hesitation is internally a race between accuracy and authority, because premature disclosure carries its own strategic risks. At the same time, adversaries and observers fill the vacuum with inference, accelerating interpretation faster than confirmation can arrive. This creates a psychological asymmetry. Silence does not stop the event. It amplifies its perceived scale. Every minute without clarity increases the weight of worst-case assumptions, allowing perception to move ahead of verified fact. In modern conflict environments, this informational gap becomes a secondary battlefield where control over narrative timing can influence escalation pathways as much as physical actions themselves. Once a high-intensity military incident enters the global information network, its impact stops being regional almost immediately and becomes systemic. Financial markets do not wait for verified casualty reports or operational confirmation. They react to probability, not certainty, pricing in risk based on the potential for escalation rather than the finality of outcomes. Energy markets are typically the first to respond, because the perceived stability of key maritime corridors directly influences global supply expectations, insurance premiums, and futures positioning. Even a theoretical disruption scenario in a critical choke point triggers rapid repricing, as traders reassess not only physical supply chains, but the credibility of deterrent structures that previously stabilized them. At the same time, defense stocks and sovereign risk indicators begin to diverge, reflecting a split between perceived military demand and geopolitical uncertainty. Beyond markets, allied coordination networks enter rapid reassessment cycles, where assumptions about force projection reliability, deployment safety, and regional escalation control are quietly reevaluated in parallel diplomatic channels. What makes these ripple effects strategically significant is their self-reinforcing nature. Economic volatility increases political pressure influences military posture, and adjusted posture feeds back into market expectations. In this loop, perception becomes a force multiplier, often moving faster than the physical situation on the ground or at sea. The result is a global feedback system where information itself behaves like an accelerating variable, amplifying uncertainty far beyond the original event. What emerges from this kind of strategic shock is not simply a reassessment of one incident, but a broader recalibration of how power itself is distributed and perceived in the modern world. For decades, global military order has been interpreted through a largely unipolar framework, where one dominant actor sets the upper boundary of projection capability and others operate within its shadow. But multipolar reality does not replace dominance overnight. It erodes its psychological monopoly first. When multiple states demonstrate credible capacity to challenge assumptions once considered uncontested, the definition of overmatch begins to fragment into regional contexts rather than global absolutes. This shift is not about a single actor surpassing another in total capability, but about the increasing ability of different powers to impose localized strategic constraints that alter decision-making calculus. In such an environment, deterrence becomes less about overwhelming superiority and more about conditional risk distribution, where outcomes depend on geography, timing, and concentration of force rather than permanent structural advantage. The most significant change is not technological, but cognitive. Planners can no longer assume that historical patterns will scale uniformly across future conflict zones. Instead, each theater must be evaluated as a distinct ecosystem of capabilities, asymmetries, and saturation thresholds. This fragmentation of certainty produces a world where military influence is no longer centralized in a single predictable hierarchy, but distributed across overlapping spheres of control, each capable of disrupting the others under specific conditions. The question now is not whether global military balance is changing, but whether decision-makers and observers are willing to recognize the speed at which it is changing before the next escalation forces that recognition into reality. Every system described in this analysis, defense networks, intelligence frameworks, market reactions, and geopolitical assumptions, depends on one fragile constant: the belief that tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough to be predictable. But once that assumption breaks, every layer built on top of it begins to lose stability at different speeds, creating a widening gap between perception and operational reality. The real uncertainty is no longer about capability alone, but about interpretation: who is reading events correctly, and who is still relying on outdated mental models to explain rapidly evolving conditions. If saturation, miscalculation, and informational lag are now structural features of modern conflict rather than anomalies, then the next major turning point will not arrive as a surprise event, but as a recognized pattern that was visible long before it was acknowledged. And that raises a final, uncomfortable question that cannot be answered in real time, only in hindsight. Are we witnessing isolated demonstrations of evolving warfare, or the early formation of a new strategic normal that has already outpaced the frameworks designed to understand it?